It's Sunday, and it's Chavov Adar. So we're doing Parsha. Every Sunday night we do Parsha. And this week, of course, we start a new Chumash. We start Sefer Vayikra. And as everybody knows, Sefer Vayikra is called Teiras Kohanim. It's because it's Teiras Kohanim. It deals with all the halachas of Kachim, of Karbanis, and Taharis, and things of purity, and so forth. It's a special Sefer, Teiras Kohanim. The Midrash says, as they fit with by Yidden, that when little children start learning Chumash, the first thing they do is a Parsha from Vayikra. You know this, right? When little children, before they start to learn Bereshis, they learn a little bit of Parsha Vayikra. They didn't see it. They fit with by Yidden. And even those lowly Ashkenazim, they do it too. Why? So the Lashon Chazal is Yoveyu Teherim v'Yisasku b'Taharis. The little kinderlach, called Hevel Shem Bechayey, Gemara says, they have no sin, should be Isaac b'Taharis, which deals with the holiness of the Karbanos. I remember as a child, we started Vayikra, we learned the first Parsha, the first few Psukim, and then we moved on to Bereshis. So we learn about Karbanos. And of course, in these Parsha classes, we try to find something interesting to focus on, and it's got to be off the beaten path. God forbid it should be typical. So I found something which is, I suppose it's not as atypical as last week. Last week we talked about you were here last week. Last week we talked about the gold thread in Parshas Pakudei. Today we're going to talk about the salt. There's a mitzvah to say in the Torah and a mitzvah leisa said. There's two mitzvahs associated with salt. The din is I'll call karbon chotakriv melach. Every carbon has to have salt. And there's a whole question in the Mefarshim, if you didn't put salt, whether the carbon is kosher or not. And the halacha is that there's two mitzvahs associated with salt. There's a mitzvah that says there's a positive commandment of putting salt on all carbonis, and there's a mitzvah that says leitashbis bris, leitashbis melach bris elikecha. You're not allowed to be mashbis, to suspend the covenant the Eibush made with melach, with salt. And that's why if you bring a carbon and you deliberately delete, don't put on the salt, you get malchus. With lav sheyesh by ma'aseh. You have to put salt on the carbon. The question is only if salt was not placed on the carbon, if b'diavad it's kosher. And I just saw it, I glanced at it. It's apparently clear. The Rambam in one place says it's kosher, another place says it's not kosher. So the way the Ragachover is masik, if I'm not mistaken, is that you have to put the salt on. If the salt falls off, the carbon is still kosher. But I didn't properly explore it, so I don't want to speak. And no one's bringing carbonis and passing halachas of salt. But there's a mitzvah say they rise to have salt, and of course, this spills over into our homes. We always have salt by a table. It says in the Torah, that a shulchan is daimel mizbeach. So when we have a sud, we put salt. Right? We don't want to be like Ashes light. We put down salt. So minig Yisrael Torah. You eat bread, you eat after bread with salt. So this is the topic that we're discussing. What's interesting is there's one pasuk in this Parsha about salt, and it doesn't appear by a korban. It appears by a mincha. The halacha was that in addition to a person being able to bring a carbon from an animal, either a goat or a sheep or an ox, you could also bring a carbon from flour and oil and wine. And there's a lot of pratim about these halachas, but there's a whole seder of menachas, of meal offerings are brought with flour and oil and so forth. And it's very complex. Nothing is simple. But because there's two categories of menachas. One was as a complement to our carbon. When you bring a carbon meil and you bring a carbon shlamim, certain carbonis that are brought that are considered positive and not negative, along with the carbon you bring nesachim, nesach. And the nesachim consisted of flour, oil, and wine. So when people brought carbonis to the Beis HaMikdash, frequently along with the carbon there was also flour, oil, and wild menachas. In addition, there's an idea of bringing a carbon mincha. A person can't afford to bring an animal. He's not wealthy enough. He can't bring a sheep, a goat, or a cow, or even birds. Teira and a ben. So people would bring flour, carbon mincha. It's called carbon ani. And the Gemara says, the Gemara says that specifically by the carbon mincha, it says, What Isha Reich Nechech La'Avaye, that Nachas Ruach, Shamarti V'Naser Etzeni, Hashem gets a special Nachas Ruach from the carbon ani, from the poor person's gift, because he's giving as much as he could. The Eibishter doesn't measure how much we gave, the Eibishter measures how much we're capable of giving. So there's a carbon mincha. At this moment, I'm not going to discuss with you the difference between the carbon mincha and the regular carbon. Maybe if the clock will go slowly, which he never does, we'll have a chance to get back to it. Let's just suffice to say that there are differences, fundamental differences, mystical differences, philosophical distinctions between a carbon mincha, between a meal and a wine offering, and a behema or an animal or a bird that was brought in the mizbeach. The Eibishter, the class for those who just walked in, is on the issue of salt. In our Parsha, there's a mitzvah saseh that you have to put salt on every carbon, and there's a mitzvah leisaseh, a negative commandment, which you don't keep your chayv malchus, to put salt on every carbon. So we're discussing that the place in the Parsha where the Eibishter chooses to put the halachas of the carbon melach is by menachas, is by flour, not by a behema. If you look on page 1, you have Pasuk Yud Gimel. This is right in the middle of the menachas. You have this 4 menachas, and then of course you have a mincha of chometz. You have 4 menachas. You have minchas seiles, you have minchas machas, minchas marcheshes, and so forth. And then it says, "V'chol korban minchoscha b'melach timloch." Every carbon, which is a mincha, technically speaking, literally speaking, mincha means a flour offering rather than a behemah, than a meat offering. But you must understand that mincha also means a gift. The translation of the word mincha is a gift, right? What do you have the word mincha first in the Chumash? Yankov sent to Esav mincha. Mincha le'esav achev. It's discussed in Sfarim. Mincha means an offering. Just like carbon means a gift and an offering. We always associate mincha with flour, but in fact the word mincha means a gift. So the Torah says when you're bringing a meal offering, which is called mincha, which is a gift, ba'melach timloch has to be salted with salt. That's a mitzvah say. Then it says, v'loi tashpis. Don't neglect. Don't do Shabbos. Don't rest. Melach, the salt, which is a bris alikecha, a covenant of your God, mi'al mincha secha, from on your karbonis mincha. And like I said to you before, that since it says v'loi tashpis, we have a mitzvah saseh and a mitzvah leisaseh. There's 2 mitzvahs. One mitzvah with salt is not sufficient. You have to have saya mitzvah saseh and saya mitzvah leisaseh. If you ever learned in Chassidus, the milos of mitzvah saseh and the milos of mitzvah leisaseh, the salt has both advantages. Esadecha leisaseh on the one hand, on the other hand, the kapara for leisaseh is more than the kapara for neseh. Yesh bazeh mashein bazeh. Carbon melach, the mitzvah to bring salt in the Beis HaMikdash is 2 mitzvahs: a positive commandment and a negative commandment. And then it says, "I'll call korban chatakriv melach." Every time you bring a carbon, you should put salt. So in one pasuk, the Torah teaches us the mitzvah of salt, and says salt 3 times. That has to say twice, we have no choice, because the Torah wants us to know that there's both a positive and a negative commandment. But who needs the 3rd time? The 3rd time is mamash hachazorah. It's 3 times. 3 times in the same pasuk, the inyan hamelach. 3 times in the same pasuk, the mitzvah of bringing salt. V'chol korban minchoscha b'melach timloch. Every mincha offering has to have salt. V'lei tashpis. Do not rest, hold back. Malach bisel lekecha me'al mincha sech is the 2nd time. And then it says, I'll call korban chatakriv melach. So of course the pshat in this is that I'll call korban goes on animals. Since mincha means flour, and by the way, there was salt put not just on flour and on meat. You know that when he did lechem aponim. You know what lechem aponim is? Lechem apanim. Shabbos, the koyanim used to eat the bread that was on the shulchan, right? The koyanim ate the bread that was on the shulchan. But the shulchan bread, they were zoicha from Gavoya. They weren't eating it from the Beis HaMikdash, they were eating it from the Eibishter. And they were shidei carbon. What did the Eibishter get from lechem upon him? The Eibishter got the levoina. The levoina was a spice that was sitting in 2 cups, 2 kelim, on top of the 2 marachas of lechem upon him. And the levoina went on the Beis HaMikdash, the mizbeach. And when the levaina went on the mizbeach, so the lechem upon it became shirei carbon. So the koyanim were not eating from the shulchan; they were actually eating the leftovers from the mizbeach. That levaina had to have salt. It was a carbon. It was a carbon with the lechem upon him, but they put salt on. Levaina is a spice. It's one of the spices of the psalmim. Levaina zaka, right? You learn Chumash. It's in Siddur. Levaina zaka was one of the spices that was used in the ketores, and it was a carbon unto itself. And there was also an inyan from a carbon levaina by itself also. People used to put salt. You don't have to salt spices. They don't exactly, not eating them. Everything that went on the Mizbeach, except for wood. Wood was a carbon eitzim too, but they didn't put salt on the Shnei Gizrei eitzim. But when they brought the Levain on the Mizbeach, they put salt. So every carbon that went on the Mizbeach had salt. So the Torah wants you to know, first of all, that when you do a carbon mincha, you should put salt. And there's an esen aleisese. And secondly, when you bring a carbon behema or a carbon knife, meat, you should also have salt. So therefore it says 3 times. Positive, negative, positive. The first positive is by a mincha, the negative is by a mincha, and the second positive is by a carbon meilah. Now, I did not see in any of them, this, what I just told you says in the Mefarshim. There's got to be a deeper pshat. This is not adequate. There's got to be a deeper explanation for why the Torah has to separate this salt for the mincha and the salt for the carbon behema and off. Which, again, I don't know whether we're going to have a sufficient chance to get to it. But let me set the stage. I wrote down at the top of your page 3 questions. And they are, first of all, there's plenty of copies. The first of all, what is the significance of using salted karbanos? Who needs salt and karbanos altogether? Second of all, why is it not sufficient to be 1 mitzvah? Dafke 2 mitzvahs, a mitzvah say and a mitzvah leisase. And lastly, how come the pasuk repeats it 3 times? First mincha, positive. Then mincha, negative. And then carbon, positive. These are the questions. So to be sure, what we're really interested in is to explore in Mefarshat Torah the significance of the fact that when a person brought a carbon, it wasn't enough that they brought themselves, and they brought an animal, and they brought flour, and they brought oil, and they brought wine, which are of course rich and meaningful things. They had a special mitzvah of bringing salt. What was the significance of bringing salt? So on the bottom of the page I wrote the syllabus, at least most of it, and some of it got erased, but let's start with Rashi. Rashi's in the upper left. Melach Bris, the salt covenant. Zakt Rashi, Shabris, Kerusal, and Melach. The Eibishter made a covenant with salt. Misheshes Mebereshes. When the Eibishter created the world originally, Shehuftachu Hamayim Matachteinim, the lower waters were promised, Likare b'mizbeach, to be offered up on the mizbeach. How? B'melach, in the form of salt. And in addition, V'nisach Hamayim B'chag. And once a year they would pour water on the mizbeach. Okay, Al kol karboncha, says Rashi, what I just told you. Al elas behema v'yof. Ve'emrei kol hakachim kulam. In addition to putting salt on the flour and the meal offerings, the Torah says again, Al kol karboncha takriv melach, that on the meat of birds and animals you also have to put salt. Rashi says exactly what I just told you. Now, to explain Rashi in more depth, I'm going to ask you to turn to page 2. Turn to the page and we'll read a Midrash. Okay, this Midrash is quite famous. It's quite famous. It's so famous that the Meitzi Le'ed, he says there's a source of it is Midrash Chachamim. He can't find a Midrash in Zman HaChazal. I made 2 arrows. We're doing the second one. Okay, the one facing left. Page 2. V'lei tashpis melach bris ... I'll call karbon chatakriv melach, that there's a positive mitzvah to put salt on every carbon, and there's a negative commandment prohibiting you from not putting salt on a carbon, even alav. And then it says a third time, I'll call karbon chatakriv melach. Whenever you bring a carbon, you should put salt. Says the Midrash as follows. And the Midrash speaks about arichas and bereishis. Shekasher nechleku hamayim atachteinim and all yonim. When the Eibishter created the world, it says in Chumash that the waters were mixed together. And the entangling of the waters, what's called the higher waters and the lower waters. Now, this is not necessarily a mystical concept. This could perhaps be even a physical concept. But these are 2 levels. The higher waters are not clouds. Clouds are part of the lower waters, like it says in the Chumash. The clouds come from vapor, which comes from the earth. That's still Mayim Tachtenim. Mayim Al-Yenim is higher waters. And when the Eibishter originally created the world, besides for the fact that the entire land was covered with water, there was no continents, it was just sea all across the globe, all the waters were mixed together, and the Eibishter separated, the higher waters rose up and the lower waters fell. And then of course the next thing that Eibishter did was, once he separated the higher waters and the lower waters, he effected that the continents should rise. It says in Rishonim that the rising of continents is Hepech HaTeva, because Al Pi Teva, land is heavier than water. So land will sink lower than water. And the fact that the continents rose, L'reika ha'oretz ala moyim, was Hepech HaTeva. The Rishonim talk about this, that the continents should rise and that water should, so to speak, go into what we call basins. big gigantic bowls that happen to be 10,000 miles across in the case of the Pacific Ocean, and the waters should descend. But the waters were crying. Why were the waters crying? Let's see what he says. Go bebchia. They were crying that they're going to be in a place of spiritual uncleanness. And the lashon which is brought mechsidis is mayim tachtein bechen ano bein lemeheva kodam malka kadisha. We want to be close to the Eibishter. Here he brings a different lashon. Why should we be in the lowly, contaminated earth where there's people and all the other lowlinesses? So the waters cried. Amalak HaMashakadosh Baruch Hu. Eibishter said, quiet, shush, still. Shitku, keep quiet. I'm going to make a mitzvah. The mitzvah of Nisach HaMayim. Once a year, we're going to make a big tumul u'shafta mayim b'sasni mayim Yeshua. We're going to take water from the earth and we're going to pour it on the mizbeach. Zog de Midrash v'leinit paisu, and they were not satisfied. Ki einam ki im pa'machas b'shana. Once a year, you pour water. That's a small representation. Zog de Midrash weiter v'kodesh la'makadosh baruch hu bris. So the Eibush made a second covenant. Sheyimlechu hakarbonos, but all the sacrifices will be salted, and if salt comes from the sea, I mean, I'm not teaching you all the Midrashim. There's maybe 6 or 7 pages of Midrashim, but the Midrashim say that the preferred salt is a salt that's called melach doimis, Saddamite salt, which is mentioned in the Keteiros say in the morning, the Karbonos say in the morning, and there's different interpretations of melach doimis, but one of them is that melach doimis is salt that comes from sea water. There's different sources of salt, but the salt, when you evaporate seawater, the salt will be left over, and some say that melach demis is sea salt. And another thing the Mepharshim say is that melach demis is very thin. It's very, very, very thin. It doesn't have any solid constitution. It's very, very, very fine. But this is what the salt that the Eibishter promised is going to use in karbanis. And of course the Chazal say that if you can't get melach doimis, use any kind of salt. As the pasuk says, "Al kol karbonacha takrif melach v'leitashbis melach." And all of your karbanis you should bring salt, and you should never stop bringing salt. There's another medrash someplace in the stack which says that the world is divided up into 3 parts. Right? A third is land, and a third is the sea, and a third is desert. So the desert, so they said like this: in the desert, the Eibishter gave the Torah. In the Yishuv where people live, the people are going to study the Torah. But the sea is complaining, we're a third of a globe, we're a third of the earth, and how are we going to represent it in Yiddishkeit? So the Eibishter said, through the water and through the salt. The second day, with the Eibishter separate the higher waters and the lower waters. So the waters complained, so the Eibishter said, you're going to use it in the Beis HaMikdash. The water once a year and the salt all the time. And it's repeated again in Leviticus and Vayikra, which happened depending on which opinion you follow. Some say it happened in the 23rd of Adar, the Ramban. Others say it happened during the first 4 days of Moshe Rabbeinu and Sinai. There's a bunch of other opinions. Now, if I would permit myself a license to interpret, which of course I do not have, I would insert the following. We're learning that the seawater is represented in 2 forms. That's once a year, annually, and once that's constant, the salt. It's reminiscent of many things. Just for example, this morning we davened, after the davening we said Sheish Zechiris. And we mentioned, what did we mention? Every day we mention Yetzias Mitzrayim. In fact, you mention it twice a day, which is why we say Vayom by day and by night. Pesach, we're going to make a Bavur Zeh, we're going to make a Seder, and we're going to sit and talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. And of course, Chassidus explains, Svarim explain, that by the Pesach Seder, you make a big shturim out of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And every day you mention Yetzias Mitzrayim. The same is true of Shabbos, and the same is true of Matan Torah, and the same is true of Bechayey Amalek, and so forth. And perhaps the same is true of the sea. Once a year you make a big deal out of the water. And all the time you sprinkle them on. The salt, Sukkos, the big shturim of Sukkos, is the Simchas Beis HaSheyeva, that according to some deists is based on the water. Shafta Mayim Esas Mani Yeshua. Right? The joy of the water, like it says in Chassidus, it's the highest joy there could possibly be. You don't make a big deal out of salt every day, but once a year you make a big deal, and on a regular basis you sprinkle on salt. Be that as it may, Rashi brings this Midrash that says that because the sea complained, why should I be deprived of being close to the Eibishter? Why should I be deprived of being part of the service of Yidden to the Eibishter? The Eibishter said, Al kol korbanach takriv melach, is a mitzvah say to bring salt, and to the mitzvah said they're not allowed to not bring salt. But there's something additional here. And this additional point is really, really the issue. The Torah uses the word bris. Go back to page 1. a covenant. Melach Bris. The Eibishter said he's going to put salt. Yeah, the Eibishter said you have to bring animals. The Eibishter doesn't make a covenant that you should bring pigeons and doves in the Beis HaMikdash. There's no covenant that you have to pour wine on the Beis HaMikdash. When it comes to salt, mitamol, the Torah calls it Bris Melach. Leitash Bris Melach Bris Alekech. The question is compounded. You'll see soon in Ramban, in 2 other places is the word melach used in conjunction with the word bris. The idea of salt being associated with the word covenant is used in 2 other places that has nothing to do with salt. The first is in Parshas Kairach, where the Eibishter speaks about the Matnas Kahuna, the idea that Hashem gave Kayanim 24 gifts. So it says over there that the 24 gifts that you have to give a Kayan are called melach bris, melach Bris Melach Olam, a covenant of salt that's forever. And the Mefarshim say, what does the gifts to the Kohen have to do with salt? And the third time is by Mishpat Malchus based David. The Eibishter says about the royal dynasty of David HaMelech that it's a Bris Melach Olam. It's a covenant of salt. So there's a link between salt and the Beis HaMikdash. There's a link between the word salt and the word bris, covenant, which is really, really weird. And it's employed in 2 other occasions as well. So we just did Rashi. Now Even Ezra.
If it was the waters that were complaining, why don't we do something with water every day?
Salt comes from water.
But it was the water that was complaining.
The water with the salt, the seawater.
You couldn't do something with water?
With the water. So once a year you pour the water, and all the time you sprinkle the salt. We'll see. Your point is well taken. Now, the Even Ezra, Bris Alekacha, the covenant of Alekacha, says the Even Ezra, he also is worried about this word Bris, and he says, Yichnasticha bebris vishpatich. That for some reason, the Eibishter felt it necessary that when it came to the salt to make a covenant and a vow. Hashem told us to bring offerings, karbanos. He didn't feel like he has to make us promise that we'll keep it. We'll sort of do it without promising. Something tells someone to do something and you sort of figure he'll do it. When it came to the salt of the Even Ezra, the Eibishter feels that he, so to speak, cannot trust us. So he says, I'm not just going to ask you to bring salt and make it connected to an Es and a Leisese, which is an Isser Lav and Malchus. I want to make it a covenant with salt. And then he adds a reason. And the Even Ezra's reason is incredibly down to earth. Who needs salt on a carbon? Rashi told us a whole story with the beginning of creation and waters crying. I never saw waters cry. Yeah, there's this Pashat. Shaloi takrif tefel. You should not bring a carbon that is tasteless. Tefel means without seasoning. It shouldn't be eaten. It's not respectful. The Even Ezra is a pushtazach. The Even Ezra says that karbonis were given to God. But everybody understands that the Eibush is not hungry. The Eibush doesn't need our meat and our bread and our cake and our orange juice. You understand? Orange juice is not kosher and cake is also not good. But you get the point. The Eibush is not hungry. Karbonis are really more for us than for him. Nevertheless, everything in the Beis HaMikdash reflects our society, not the Eibish's. Hashem doesn't have a society. And when we eat ordinary food, and on special occasions, eat special food. What's a sign of special occasions? Meat and wine. And simcha lebabasa, and simcha lebayayin. And when you eat bread, you eat taka, the best bread made from silas, from the finest flour. So in the Beis HaMikdash, the karbonos were made from the choicest food that people would consume. Who eats meat without salting it? It has no taste. So Even Ezra said you put salt on meat when you give it to the Eibishter for the same reason you would put salt on meat when you ate it yourself. It's such ketam, tefel. Al Rebbe is going to say on page 9 in your stack. Al Rebbe is going to say salt doesn't taste like anything, and yet it brings the flavor out of everything. You don't put salt on something, it loses its flavor. So the Torah said, "Al kol karbon chatakativ melach." Just like you wouldn't eat meat without salt, you wouldn't eat bread without salt, you shouldn't be carbon without salt. Pashat b'pashat. It's a very practical explanation for why salt was brought. When you eat bread, you eat salt. And when you eat meat, you eat salt. I suppose from a perspective of Yiddishkeit, salt on bread is more important. So the Torah says, V'chol karban mincha. What's mincha? Mincha is bread. First of all, when you eat bread, you should use salt. And then he finishes off the pasuk, Al kol karbon chatakev melach. When you're eating meat, even though perhaps meat can be theoretically eaten without salt, you should eat meat also with salt. You should bring the Eibush, the salt, together with his meat. It shouldn't be tafel, it shouldn't be bland, it shouldn't be without flavor. This was the Even Ezra. Now I want to just show you a chizkuni. The chizkuni is on the right, near the top. B'melach v'lei b'mei melach, with salt and not with salt water. It says v'chol korban minchoscha b'melach timlach. It could simply say v'chol korban minchoscha timlach. You should take minchas and you should salt them. B'melach timlach is a double lashon. So the chizkuni says, as somebody here just pointed out, even though it was the salt water that prayed, don't pour salt water on a carbon. Separate the salt from the water, and the salt alone you put on the carbon. Why? I don't know at the moment. Then it says, Timlach kedina, you have to salt it as Allah is. V'shir, Rabbi Tzenu kashir gedera. How much salt you put on the carbon? The same amount of salt you'd put in your own pot. Which is essentially the same thing as the Even Ezra. Please.
From before, so you said that Hashem said to make a bris.
He connects the salt with a covenant.
Right, but can you explain that more?
What if you have
why
a
do you
black
need a
pressure?
bris for this?
Again, bepashtus. Of course, you and I understand that there's greater depth. The Alter Rebbe, the Eibishter felt that he needs to, so to speak, strengthen. When you tell someone to do a mitzvah, yeah,
I know, but why by this?
by salt, I can understand why. It's not, salt is not equal to bread and meat. Bread and meat is chaticha. Eibishter needs a little bit of salt. So Teda underscores salt is as important as the meat and the bread, and I'm going to make a covenant to, so to speak, reinforce it. This is the pshat and the Even Ezra. Now, before we read the Ramban, I want you to see the Midrash, which is on page 2. The Midrash on the right side. Now we have a little bit of a time restraint because there's so much stuff here, it's incredible. And I actually wrote on the right side of the margin 5 hesbedim of what salt is al Kabbalah. 5 different pshatim of what salt is al Pnimis Hanyanim. If we get all 5 in, we will have had a successful class. But page 2, Kuf Yud, on the right now. Melach Bris, Amar Rab Shimon ben Lakish says Rish Lakish, Nema Bris ben Melach, Nema Bris ben Yisurim. The word covenant is used in conjunction with the salt, and the word covenant is used in conjunction Nebach with Yiddish Tzaris, Eile Divrei Abris. In Pashas Bechayey, and then in Pashas Kisaveh. Nema Bris ben Melach. Where do you see the word Bris by salt? The Ksiv, Leitash Bris Melach Bris. And like I told you earlier, it's in 2 other places in Tanakh where salt is linked to the word covenant. Nema Bris ben Yisurim. And by Yinebach Yiddish Tzaris, the word covenant is also employed. The Ksiv, Eile Divrei Abris. So the Midrash translates Ma Bris ha'omar ben Melach. Just as the word Bris, which is written by salt, Melach mamtekes es habasar, it makes meat sweet. Skip the bracket. Av Bris ha'omar be Yisurim, chas v'shalom, a Yid goes through a hardship. Yisurim memalkin kolav, in Yisrael Shalom, the suffering that a person goes through wipes away and sweetens the person. So Rabbi say, here you have a little bit of a new inyan. In addition to salt adding flavor, salt sweetens. Now salt doesn't sweeten, salt salts. The connotation of salt sweetening, and perhaps we'll see it later on, is that salt brings out the natural flavor. When you put salt around meat, it's not that you want to taste the salt, it's that through the salt, the richness of the food that you're eating is brought out. So there's a second aspect here. There's the idea that when you eat food, bread, mincha, and carbon meat, you eat it with flavoring. It shouldn't be tafel, it shouldn't be bland. You put salt. And in addition, there's the idea that salt brings out the natural flavors of the bread and the meat that you're eating. This is the Midrash. Now on page 3 I have Rabbeinu Bechayey. And Rabbeinu Bechayey has Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet. I marked them very clearly in my unbelievable handwriting, which requires a scientist and a linguist to read. So the first thing that he brings is the Even Ezra. Baldarach HaPshat, he brings the Even Ezra, that a carbon without salt is like food without salt, which is not respectful. And the second thing that he brings is a Rambam. And this Rambam is consistent with Shitas Shel Rambam. I was contemplating bringing in the original, but the Rambam is mamish 2-3 words in the Midrash, and the Rabbeinu Bechayey quotes him, so we saved us a piece of paper. The Rambam, as some of you know, has an entire section in the Midrash which is called Taimi HaMitzvahs, which gives reasons for mitzvahs. It's really the second half of section 3 of the Rambam's Meideh, which is the easiest section of all and the least philosophical. And the last, whatever it is, many chapters, from around 25 till around 50, the Rambam gives Taimi HaMitzvahs, reasons for mitzvahs. And the Rambam says that many, many, many mitzvahs are the Eibishter's reaction to idol worship, to Avodah Zarah, including Karbanos. And last year I gave you a class on it, where we talked about reasons for Karbanos. And the Rambam says that all the sacrifices, with many, many, many other things, like the prohibition against eating blood, and the idea of putting the fat on the Mizbeach, and numerous other things, are a reaction of the Eibishter to Karbanos, to sacrifices. And of course, I don't want to give you a long ariches, but the Welt stürmt. People say that since the Rambam says that Karbanos, that sacrifice, are a reaction to idol worship, and nobody worships idols anymore, so let's cancel sacrifices. I mean, you hear that in certain circles, and they blame it on the Rambam God. So I discussed this at length last year, and I explained that Avodah Zarah doesn't mean the reality of idol worship. Avodah Zarah means the human tendency towards idol worship. Idol worship is not only something that happened. Idol worship is built into the human condition, and I'll tell you how. What is idol worship in essence? Idol worship is the belief that there's more than one power involved in the creation. There's more than one force. God is not singular. There are different forces. There's the sun, there's the moon, there's the stars, there's the sea, there's the land, there's the tides. There's many, many contributing forces. And idol worship believes that these forces have intelligence, and you can work them against each other. The essence of idol worship is not the sacrifice, it's not the manipulation of the gods, it's the belief in shniyos, in the opposite of achdus. And I believe personally that this is what the Rambam is saying. Avodah Zarah is built into the human condition. It's very difficult for people to relate to one God that's completely invisible and totally not subject to manipulation. Can't work him over. You can pray, you can daven, but you can't manipulate to get your wishes based on sacrifices or incense, whatever shtusim that Avodah Zarah had. The essence of idol worship is just the idea of the division. And the whole concept of karbanes is to say to God, everything is yours. The model of a sacrifice, it's not what we're giving, is that we're saying, this is yours, this is yours. The whole idea of a sacrifice is to speak and focus that it's all one. This is the essence of idol worship, of karbanes and many other things, as the Rambam understands, the way I explained it. So the Rambam sees karbanes as a reaction not only to the fact that people worship idols, but to the fact that in the human possibility people are predisposed to fall into this tendency, like it happened in the third generation. Adam's grandson Enish was already the Eibishter became a chulin. They got involved in idol worship and so forth. And karbanes is a reaction to this tendency. And since it's in the human condition, Kabbalah's never finished. As long as people have Yetzer Hara's, as long as people have this split within themselves that needs to be constantly reminded of unity, you have to bring Karbanos. This is the essence of it. And many aspects of Karbanos are reaction to aspects of the emphasis of idol worship. And one of them was blood. Blood. If you're familiar with the Rambam discusses this, a lot of the Rishonim talk about this. There were different forms of idol worship. There were more sophisticated idol worship, there was more primitive idol worship. And the lower idolaters were not even worshipping angels, they were worshipping the demons, the Shadim, the Se'idim. And they believed that life is in the blood, and that by collecting the blood, they were able to manipulate the Se'idim, the demons. So the Eibishter says, no blood. In other words, blood, which is the life of an animal, you're not going to partake of. You're going to completely spill it. You're going to give it away to the Eibishter. Again, with the same emphasis that life is God's, and that's it. So the Rambam says this is why you had to put salt on a korban, to take out any drop of blood. V'das harabe arav Rabbeinu Moshe Zal Beis. The opinion of Rabbeinu Moshe as the Rambam is B'tam HaMelech Ki minhag evdi ha'akum lahanchik HaMelech v'nakabanas. Goyim refused to include salt in sacrifice. Umayasim boy, and they found salt abhorrent. V'layakrivu klal, they wouldn't sacrifice it at all. Let me just interject. they would also sacrifice very, very sweet things. Because they figured if it's sweet for me, it must be sweet for God. And they would also sacrifice things that had been leavened. So the Eibishter says, Se'ed dvash, leavened bread, and dvash, sweet things, not allowed to bring, karbanos not allowed to have honey, not allowed to be sweet. Because the goyim, the idolaters, gave the Eibishter sweet things, as if you, so to speak, bribing him and appealing to him. So the Eibishter says, no sweet things. On the other hand, they did not bring salt, so we dafka bring salt. Because salt is not sweet. And most importantly, because salt takes away the blood, and they therefore refuse to incorporate salt in their worship. Blood should never be lost. Therefore the Torah mandates dafke to use salt, because salt represents removing the blood. You're not making an entity out of the blood unto itself, you're giving it away to the Eibishter. This is what the Rambam says. Is there greater depth to this? We'll see perhaps later. But this is what the Rambam adds, okay? So the Rashi said that the reason for salt was to deal with a covenant made at the beginning of creation. Even Ezra says that salt poshet was you don't eat food without salt, it should be tasty for the Eibishter. Another one of the Mefarshim said that salt sweetens and Yisurim sweeten. Rambam says that salt is part of the greater scheme of what karbanos are about, to negate anything associated not just with the actual idol worship, but with the tendencies, with the tinetiyes that are associated with idol worship. And that's why salt was dafka used. Go ahead.
Is this what karbanos came after the idolaters?
The question is what the Ramban asks. Adam Rishon brought karbanos. He wasn't reacting to idol worship. He was the first human being. That's what Ramban objects very vehemently. So this is my answer, that Adam brought karbanos not because idolatry existed, but because Adam brought karbanos because he understood that you have to constantly reinforce unity. Because idolatry is the opposite of that. So Adam Rishon brought a sacrifice before division ever developed, as his way of declaring Hashem is the only king of the earth. His grandson already started to make the divisions. You understand? So we're bringing karbanos like Adam Rishon brought karbanos. He brought karbanos preemptively, and we're bringing karbanos. Also, it's not just, the point is, it's not just a reaction. Some people say Rambam is saying karbanos is a reaction to idolatry. It's not. It's a reaction to people. And since idolatry existed in such a prevalent way, it's a simon that's part of the human condition. And see, in the modern times, we don't worship these retarded gods, but we certainly have the issue of idolatry. Who believes in unity? If you believe in God, you don't believe that everything comes directly from the Eibishter. You believe in the laws of nature, and you believe in random. That's the philosophy of idol worship. You understand? And the whole idea of a karban was to declare through your speech and through your action and through your kavanah, L'Hashem ha'aratzon lo'yeh, the Eibishter is the only master of the world. So it's always relevant. It's relevant every moment. Now the third pshat is the Midrash that we discussed earlier in Rashi. And the fourth pshat is a Kabbalah, which Ramban brought. So we're going to leave the Rabbeinu Bechayey alone. We're going to learn the Ramban and we'll see it. Okay, now what's next on my list? Tosfos, which is on page 4. The Tosfos adds a sweet word, a simple, nice, sweet word. And he introduces us to a new detail about salt, which we have not yet had, but it's brought up in subsequent Mefarshim. He adds another point, benegeh to salt. And that is, we've been talking about how salt extracts blood. We've been talking about how salt adds flavor. And we've also talked about it that salt sweetens. And the difference between salt adding flavor and salt sweetening is, salt adding flavor is the flavor of the salt. Salt sweetening is that through the salt you taste the food itself. He adds another thing. Salt is also, and by the way, Ibn Ezra mentioned the idea that salt is machris, salt is associated with death, which we didn't get to yet, we'll see it in the Ramban. He has another thing, salt is a preservative. There's two opposite things about salt. Salt preserves and salt is death. Nothing is alive in the Yam HaMelech. That's what they claim. Salt has no life. On the other hand, salt does not allow things to decompose. In the days before refrigeration, right? How old is electromagnetics? How old is electricity? In the days before refrigeration, go back 100 years, 200 years, before they had ice boxes and so forth and so on, if you wanted to preserve meat and fish, you used salt. That's why in the Middle Ages, salt was more expensive, pound for pound, than gold. Did you know that? You go back 300 years, a pound of salt was worth more than a pound of gold. Bepashtas. That's how the Polish were so rich, because they had salt mines. They were not sophisticated people, but they had mineral deposits. They had salt. And salt in those days was more valuable pound for pound than gold. And what's salt today? It's nothing. The doctor tells you, take it out of your diet. It's not healthy. For blood pressure, sodium, and so forth. But then it was a preservative. That's how people lived. So he brings a nachak fetch, that the salt has to do with preservation. And he explains, like, it preserves. The idea to teach us that sacrifices are bris, la'olam, la'kapara. They are covenant forever to atone. Hashem doesn't need sacrifice. Hashem doesn't neither eat nor drink. When a person sins, then he brings a sacrifice and he's forgiven. He knows he's clean from sin. He protects himself from sinning a second time. To sin again and filthily soil himself spiritually a second time. But if a person would do a sin and then bring a carbon and feel like he has not been cleansed, they would think, I'm still dirty, I might make myself more dirty. As the Gemara says, if you do an aveda many times, you do something so many times, you start thinking it's permitted. And therefore, the whole idea of a carbon is not just to forgive you for your sins, but to forgive you for your sins, and therefore to be the biggest encouragement not to repeat it. If you know that your tshuva was accepted by the Eibush, you were forgiven, you're much more likely not to repeat it than if you have to constantly deal with the sin. So you put salt on a carbon to underscore that the carbon preserves the piety and the sanctity of a Jew. Through the carbon, the Jew is preserved from sinning again. So salt becomes a symbol. The symbol is, just like salt preserves, karbonas preserve. So you have nacha kvetch, nacha nuance. I think we've had 4 or 5 different ideas about salt, right? What is it? Salt adds flavor. Salt brings out the sweetness. Salt is death. And salt is a preservative. These are different insights into what salt is. And for all of these reasons, and some more, the Eibishter says there's a covenant. Every carbon, I'll call carbon chatakriv melech. This was the Tosfos. Now there's an Abarbanel. I don't have time for the Abarbanel inside. I just want to say a vart from the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel is on page 5, but I'm not reading it with you. I wrote on the top of the page the summary of what it was I wanted to teach, so you can read it. If you can decipher my handwriting. I write in code. Sometimes I can read my own code, and sometimes I have to get a decipher for myself. The Torah says you put salt on flour, on the karbonas melach, mincha, flour, meal offering. And then the Torah says you put salt on the meat. Right? And the first thing I told you when I started the class is how come the Torah brings the union of salt dafka by the meal offerings and mentions it as an afterthought, I'll call karbon chatakriv melech by the meat as well. I told you a pashta word. Because salt goes more importantly on bread than it goes on meat. The Abarbanel, and again, we're not done. We're not done, and we're not going to finish, but the Abarbanel has nocha nekuda. And that is, the reason to put salt on bread is different than putting salt on meat. There's one reason to put bread on salt on bread, and that is so it shouldn't be bland. It should have a flavor. There's 2 reasons to put salt on meat. Number 1, that it should have a flavor, and number 2, that the meat should hold, should be preserved. It's 2 different in Yonim. What the pnimius of this is, I don't know, but he does articulate this nekuda, that there's only 1 reason for salt on the karbonis mincha, and there's actually 2 reasons for the salt on the karbonis of oif and behema, birds and animals. Now this sort of ends the pshat portion of today's class. And as was already pointed out, Baruch Hashem, it's 10 minutes to 8 and the class hasn't even started yet. I want you to go back to page 1 and I want to do with you the Ramban. And the Ramban, so to speak, opens us up into the mystical realms, the mystical planes, the mystical dimensions associated with this salt. With Parsha Vayikra Bris, the Parsha of salt. It's a very, very interesting mitzvah. And you know how it is. You learn Torah, and you're so curious. So what's going on behind the scenes? So if you have the good fortune to be a teacher, and you get to choose topics, you pick those weird ones, So this is what we're doing. Amaisa Midzalz. So he begins by bringing Rashi, and he follows it up by bringing the Ibn Ezra. And then we have Uba'avur. If you're on page 1, on the bottom of the page, on the right, you have a big arrow and 4 little arrows. You see? We are doing the 3rd little arrow. The word Uba'avur is circled. You see? You see, Rabbi Isa, yes? Uba'avur shehu bris bekarbonis. Since salt is a covenant regarding karbonis, Yaseh hakosuv zeis habris of l'chol habris. Karbonis, sacrifice, is very important. It's not just a mitzvah, it's a very, very important mitzvah, because it was done in the most important place in the world, in the Beis HaMikdash. Of all the things that were sacrificed in the Beis HaMikdash, a covenant is made specifically for salt. There's no covenant made for meat and for bread. A covenant is made for salt. And perhaps the reason is, as I told you earlier, it's the kind of thing that you would forget, so the Eibush has to reinforce it. So the Eibush says, salt, don't forget, there's a bris, there's a covenant. Says the Ramban, since in the Beis HaMikdash, when it comes to karbonis, there's a covenant associated with salt, salt becomes a symbol. Salt becomes a moshel, a semel for covenants. When you want to carve something in stone, when you want to preserve something, and make something permanent, we say etched in stone. The Torah says it's a covenant of salt, bris melach. Because the initial bris melach, the covenant associated with salt in the karbonis, makes salt a symbol for all covenants. Ibn Ezra said that the word salt has to do with kodesh, which is the 4th translation. Kodesh means death. If you don't keep the covenant, it affects kodesh. Bris melach, it's a covenant, and if you don't keep it, it brings to salt. Salt is the opposite of life. Ramban didn't like Ibn Ezra's interpretation, so he gives you his own. That the Eibush made a covenant for salt, so salt becomes the symbol for all covenants. So in 2 other occasions in Tanakh, salt is used as a denotation, as a partner to the word bris. And let's read it. V'yeme b'matnes kahuna u'b'malchus David, on 2 other occasions. In Parshas Kairach, by the 24 gifts that were given to the Kohanim. And in the Tanakh, in the book of Kings, where the Eibush determines and announces once and for all, in the Chronicles, that the dynasty of David HaMelech is destined to be forever. In both of those places, he uses the word bris melach, the covenant linked to salt, which we could also employ the word preserve. It's preserved. The royal dynasty of David HaMelech is preserved forever as salt preserves. Okay? Ki hu kayim ki bris melach b'karbonis. It's permanent, just like the salt covenant in karbonis. Then he brings the Ibn Ezra, says the word bris means krusa, to cut, and the Ramban doesn't like the Ibn Ezra's pshat, and so forth. 4 lines from the end of the page, of the column. But now the Ramban thickens the plot, and he gives what is, in my opinion, 2 different interpretations, and I marked them, Aleph, and then near the end of the Ramban, I put the letter Beis. The Ramban has a question. And the Ramban question is a very important question, but it's a question that requires pre-information. If you don't have a certain detail, you'll just miss the question. And that is, the Ramban says in Parshas Yisrei, a cloud. And he repeats it again at the beginning of Vayikra. Whenever we talk about karbonis, we always use Shem Havaya. We know that Al Pisad Hashem has different names. Hashem, Elikim, Tzvokei, Shakai, Kelchoel, Eke, and so forth, Adnai. But whenever we talk about karbonis, we strictly and exclusively use Shem Havai. This is the Ramban's opinion, because it's called Shem HaMiyuchad, the choicest name, the singular name of God. Or as Chassidus would say it, it's the only name of God that nobody shares with him. Tzvois, others use. Shaddai, others use. Elikim, others use. Kael, others use. Havaya, only the Eibush, and nobody else is used by that name. So the Ramban says karbonis are always used in conjunction with Shem Havai. He asks Klotz Kasha. How come over here it says V'leitash bis melach bris elekecha? It should say V'leitash bis melach bris Hashem, if it's a carbon. And therefore the Ramban wants to say that the bris elekecha is not on a carbon, it's on something else. Umipnei she'omar kan brisa lekecha. 4 lines from the bottom of the first column. Le'omar bris Hashem. Keloshen ha'parsha u'kederach kol ha'karbonis. Karbonis are always spoken in conjunction with Shem Havaya. How come over here it's shrunken with Shem Elikim? Or sheyemar bris Havaya lekecha. Or at least you should say that with Kol Hashem Shalom Hashem and Elikim. Ani sever. Says Ramban, I have a new opinion. And the new opinion is as follows. Ki inyan shahamelach mayim. You should know that salt is really water. Or in other words, salt and water are not two things together, they're really one entity. The Eibush created water. And in water there's natural salinity. Zaltz, salt. And he says, and when you use heat, the water, the moisture evaporates, and what's left is the salt. The water half of the water naturally sates the earth and it makes things sprout and grow. But when the water has been evaporated and what's left over is the salt, that very same component brings death to every place. When it burns up the earth, it can't seed and it will never grow. So water has within itself water and salt. And the water is the chesed part of the water, and the salt is the gevura part of the water. And melach bris elekecha lashon gevura. In water you have the water half, and of course the water was brought once a year in Sukkot, the Shafta Mayim Besas Manya Yeshua, Simchas Beis Hashiva. And the gevura half is constant, there's out the salt. So the Ramban says that the salt is the elekim part of the bris, but it's not salt, it's water. And water is a combination of Hashem and Elikim. You'll have to wait. V'hinei habris klula mikol hamidas. A covenant has to have every midah. And in general, every midah means the 2 midas of chesed and gevura. So the idea of bris, melach, bris alekecha, there's a variety of different ways of reading this. But the simple way of reading this is that the Eibush is making a covenant. If the Eibush is making a covenant, he must employ all midas, all attributes. A covenant means a binding act which can never be severed. If it's binding and never be severed, it has to be powerful from every point of view, from every angle. Kol tzadim and kol pina. Therefore, says the Ramban, there has to be both chesed and gevura in a bris. So when he says salt, he doesn't mean salt exclusively. He means even salt. What makes it a covenant is that even the salt is offered as a korban. Melach bris alekecha, what makes salt a covenant is because the salt represents the gevura half. And the water, which is chesed, obviously is included. Why? Because it's a source of life. Since the Eibishter wants to make a bris with Yidden, and to make a bris, something which is binding from every imaginable angle, therefore, the way I'm reading the Ramban now, and this is very debatable, but the way I read the Ramban is, our covenant has a certain power. Right? You and I make a deal because of a certain circumstance, and the circumstance changes, the deal is off. But if you make a deal, and the deal is supported by various different arguments, various different strengths, therefore the circumstance changes, so it's not this that's preserving the deal, it's something else. The Eibush makes a covenant. Covenants don't make sense. A covenant means something which is binding that cannot be altered. How can something be binding and unalterable? Circumstances change, and the answer is a covenant is something which is binding under all conditions because it encompasses every possibility. So melach bris doesn't mean the covenant of salt. It means even salt. What makes it a covenant is that it involves all the midas. So I wrote on the margin of your page Aleph, Zun, Mikayim, Ramban. You see, I wrote you a list of 5 explanations of this theme of salt. The Ramban's first interpretation, at least the way I am learning it with you, is that the preserving quality of salt is not salt, it's water. And what's the idea? That in water you have a combination of all extremes, every midah, chesed and gevura, and every variation in between, and that's the only thing that can create a binding force that's unalterable. Now, I will concede that you can read this Ramban differently. If you're familiar with Kabbalah, you can read this Ramban differently. But this is my understanding of it. He says, I'm reading the second line of the left column, V'amayim v'esh boyim bo. It combines both water and fire. V'deha toso bo hamshalah rishein. It's a lashon ha'pasuk, which means, and because of this, it brings things back to their first condition. What is the first condition? Mamlachas Hashem, that the Eibush is the king over the whole world. Kemelach, like salt, that on the one hand, sheetin tam b'cholam ha'cholam, it puts flavor into food. And in addition, v'takayim, it preserves. And on the other hand, v'tachir b'mlichus, it can also destroy. B'mlichus, it can also destroy. V'ni'amelach kebris. So salt is like that concept of a covenant. Now, for those of you who are Mukubalim, bris means yesod. Yesod, the end of Zeir Anpin, the end of Zohar, end of the Midas. And the way the first pshat of the Ramban is read, v'leitashpis melach bris alakecha, he means, v'leitashpis bris, do not nullify the Eibishter's covenant, which includes also salt. So according to the interpretation that we're having now, the significance of salt is not salt by itself, it's salt as a part of the greater concept of bris, of water also. And then, if you go down a few lines, he talks about David HaMelech, and he talks about Karbanis, and he says the same thing. David HaMelech's sovereignty, David HaMelech's family dynasty is forever, because it's a covenant associated, an unreasonable vow. The preserving quality is called bris. What makes a bris? In the times of the greatest love, in the times of the greatest strength, and in all circumstances in between, there's a covenant, because even salt, even gvura, is a part of the covenant. This is how the Ramban reads it in the initial interpretation. Then at the very, very end, he says cryptic words. I've already indicated someplace else, and I don't know where that someplace else is. The Moitzel La'er tells you to look at Pashas Kisisa. I looked 3 times, I didn't find nothing. To look someplace else, Pirush Sholosh Tevas Alalu Bris Olam Hi, Bris Melach Olam Hi. These words, Bris Olam Hi, is not in our Parsha. The words Bris Melach Olam is in Pashas Khairach, by the Matnas Kuhuna. And the Ramban tells you to look someplace else. I couldn't find that someplace else. But this is a second interpretation. Okay, Rabbi say, please tune in, because now we're not just reading translations of the Psukim. We're talking about the philosophy. Why did the Eibush make a covenant of salt? So the initial interpretation of the Ramban is, it's not salt, it's water. Why water? Because water has everything in it. And to have a covenant, to create a binding force, which will always remain, you need something that encompasses every midah. So Latashbis Bris Melach means salt also. This is the initial interpretation of the Ramban. This last line, which is so cryptic and so incomprehensible, is explained by the Rikanti, who quotes the Ramban, and it's on page 6. The Ramban says, no pshat. This Rikanti is interpreting what I think is the second pshat in the Ramban. Although the Rikanti quotes the Ramban and disagrees with him, it's my humble opinion that the Rikanti is quoting the first pshat in the Ramban and disagreeing. These last few words, which are cryptic, I believe that Ramban is saying the same thing as the Rikanti is. And that is as follows. You see, the message of the Ramban was that for something to be a covenant, it has to involve opposites. But there's another message. And the other message is, everybody who's learned even the smallest amount of Chassidus and Kabbalah is familiar with the idea that Seder Ishtalshalos, the order of how things descend from a higher level to a lower level, is a series of interactions. Mashpia Makabel, giver and receiver, masculine and feminine. Right? We all know this. And it's always, the rule of thumb always is that the mashpia, the giver, the masculine, is higher and more blessed, richer, more bestowed. The makabel, the lower, the feminine, is more restrained. But if you don't have the restriction, you can't give. Too much is as bad as too little, or worse. So the idea is, the mashpia gives, the makabel receives and gives, but the makabel controls, manipulates, focuses the gift, that it should be constructive rather than destructive. This is classic Kabbalah. Everybody understands. Consequently, in Kabbalah, there's the masculine and feminine aspect. The masculine aspect in general is called chesed. The feminine aspect in general is called din, gvura. And another word for the masculine aspect is bris. So the Rikanti says, Leitash is bris melach. Bris is masculine and melach is feminine. It's similar to, but not identical with the Ramban we just read. The Ramban understands bris melach as chesed and gevura in Zoh, in Yesod. The Rikanti says it's mashpia makabel. There's a higher level and a lower level. The higher level is sweet. The lower level is salty, it's bitter. V'leitashpis bris melach translates to Rikanti, never cease to combine sweetness with the salt. Salt by itself is judgment, it's destructive. In the Eibishter's world is dinim. V'leitashpis bris melach doesn't mean the covenant of salt. It means joining salt with the covenant. That salt by itself should not become destructive. And if you look inside, he says, page 6, the lower right, which is a little bit different than the aforementioned Ramban. The waters of the physical ocean are indicative of the higher waters. Why are they salted? Because Malchus of Atzilus is salty, is dinim. You cannot approach the Eibishter without salt, without judgment. In other words, if you want to have a relationship with the Eibishter, you need to have restriction and restraint. But restriction and restraint is necessary, but it's also gvuris. Kedaminin, like it says, bezois. Bezois means with this, lashon nekeva. Yav yad al kedesh, can you approach holiness? Al kei nama v'chol karban minchoscha b'melach timlach. Al zeh imiz ramaz akosov. You have to approach the Eibishter, which is what a karban is. It's impossible to approach the Eibishter without dinim. So you put on the carbon salt. You want a connection with God. So you're traveling from the bottom to the top, from the lower level to the higher level. You put salt on. Salt is a way of saying focus. Dinim, judgment, severity. It's allowing you to connect to the Eibishter. But then he continues, and he brings a few words from a pasuk in Tanakh, which says that after we bring our carbon, and in bringing a carbon we're trying to approach the Eibishter. And in trying to approach the Eibishter, you need salt, which focuses us. Then there's a river which flows from heaven to earth that sweetens it. In other words, when you bring a carbon, you are raising yourself up to the Eibishter. In order to raise yourself up to the Eibishter, you have to have the dinim, the gevuras, which focus the carbon to go in the right place. And the Eibishter sweetens the judgment with bris, with the nohar, as he calls it. And he brings a zayah. This is the next paragraph. And again, I'll tell it to you orally. He asks, how come the ocean is salty? And he says the ocean is salty because it's far away from the Eibishter. And you have to sweeten the waters of the ocean. This is what he says. And sweetening the waters of the ocean is connecting bris with melach. Not that the bris is melach. Salt is the covenant. To the contrary. The second interpretation sees salt as being judgment. And the covenant is sweetness. And you want to sweeten the judgment. This is how we interpret it. So the Rikanti is different, similar to, but distinctly different than the Ramban that we read. And it's my opinion, like I told you, that the Ramban is actually hinting it in those last three words. Bris, melach, oilam is a combination. Bris is chesed, is zoh, melach is nukva, oilam has a connection to oilam, and so forth. That's the second interpretation. Now there's a Panim Yafos. Panim Yafos is incredible. And the Panim Yafos is on page 8. And I'm going to have to finish with the Panim Yafos. Kisvei Arizal. Kisvei Arizal is the classic. Kisvei Arizal is on page 7. Kisvei Arizal is the mamish, the classic thing. He says that personally and cosmically, Adam and Chava messed up the world to the original sin. And therefore, personally and cosmically, we need to correct the world. How do you correct the world? By unifying it and bringing it to the Eibishter. So he says this is the very famous vart that everybody knows. So you have to raise up everything in yourself and everything in your world to the Eibishter. And in general, it's 4 categories. Medaber, people, which is the person who brings the carbon. Chai, animals, which is the behema, the nefesh habahamis. The Arizal used the lashon nefesh habahamis. The tzemeach, the plant, which is the flour and the wine and the oil. And the daimim, the minerals, the water and the salt. So he gives it a classic Kabbalistic explanation that a carbon has to be whole. And his expression is, you want to raise a building up properly, you have to raise it up from the bottom. So salt has to be included, because salt is the lowest thing that's incorporated into a carbon, because if a carbon is to be brought and to serve the purpose that carbons are meant to serve, which is to overturn and correct the original sin, the carbon has to raise the world from the very, very bottom, and the lowest level is the mineral kingdom, and that's why there's a covenant by salt. Because if you've raised up the lowest level, naturally you've raised up the levels above it. This is Arizal. This is very famous. You've heard this 101 times. But the Panim Yafos has something very interesting. And I suppose I don't have time to read the whole Panim Yafos inside with you, but it's really, really worthwhile struggling through this Panim Yafos. Panim Yafos says like this. The second half is Reina Kabbalah, Oila Kabbalah. I'm not going to read it. The first half. He says everything in the Eibishter's world goes in pairs. There's no singularity. Because singularity is God. That's it. Besides, for the Eibush, everything is dual. Insane. That says a Chazal. When the Eibush created Adam Rishon, there was kineh b'maaseh bereishis. HaKadosh Baruch Yochad ba'al yedim and Adam Yochad b'tachtenim. So he made him a wife. Single is only God. The Eibush is the only one. And creation is about bringing unity into the duality, or raising up the duality to the oneness. So he says a very fiery kavod, the Panim Yafos. If you get to the very, very essence of the creation, you will find in the creation oneness. The bedrock, the lowest level. You should know that any place you look, you see duality. Everything is two, everything is pairs. Everything is pairs to indicate you're not your own boss. There's something above you. Except for the Eibishter. But he argues if you'll delve all the way to the very, very, very deepest level, the lowest level, you'll find unity there also. Because that's the presence of God in the creation itself. And it's represented by salt. It's the opposite extreme. And he says this is Pshat in Ramban. I don't know how he got this out of the Ramban. You're bringing a covenant of salt. What's the big deal of salt? So he says that salt represents, it symbolizes the element of elements, the source of source, the most rudimentary, the most fundamental building blocks of creation. I allowed myself to interpret, I wrote on the first page, Hakel Hoyim and Offer. There's a pasuk in Tanakh. Everything comes from earth. But it doesn't mean earth that you see. It means from the most basic element. It says in Sifrei Chakira, Sifrei Machshava, there's fire, wind, water, and earth. And fire, wind, water, and earth have a chomer hiyuli. There's a more basic elemental particle, which becomes fire, wind, water, and earth. He says salt represents the most basic point of everything in the creation. And he calls it Yesoid, the foundation of the creation itself. And he says it's the lahag, that's the opposite of Achdas Hashem. Or in other words, he's saying when you get down to the very, 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 very essence of physical things, that's godliness. And it's represented by salt. So the Torah says, V'chol korban, korban min choscho b'melach timlach. You bring a korban from flour, bread, or meat. You have to put salt on it. Because the concept of salt is that it's lower than hakava. It's lower than complexity. The Eibishter is higher than complexity. Salt is before complexity. It's the simplest, most rudimentary dimension of everything that the Eibishter created. And you want to declare that this is the Eibishter's in bringing it as a korban. And if I can bother you, I don't have time to read it all, but if you could look here. On page, I wrote 6 and 8. It's supposed to be page 8. The 6 should have been crossed out. Or maybe it is crossed out, but it's mystical, yeah? You see what I'm reading? On the left side, Vehine haYeseid ha'achrenu ha'melach. The very lowest level of Yeseid, which means, so to speak, the most elemental level of physical existence is salt. Shuma'at min arkova. It's the furthest thing from duality. It's the furthest thing from creating unity. To use fancier words, unity is about life. And order is about life. Since salt is not about life, it's not about unity. Okay? Kila yizrev le'yatzmiach, can't make living things from it. Okay, Lachain, the Gemara says, Anedim and Amazin, Mutab Mayim B'melach. If you say you're not going to eat food, you're allowed to drink water and eat salt. It's not considered nourishment. It's not considered nourishment. On the other hand, you can't live without water and salt. Tasteless food cannot be eaten. It preserves everything and puts flavor into everything. So he says 3 things about salt. Salt adds flavor, adds taste, it adds flavor, and it preserves. So salt by itself represents something so elemental. There's no duality yet. And yet all duality and all life are dependent upon it. So when you're bringing a korban to the Eibush, I want to make a covenant with the gift of salt. I want to make a covenant with the gift of salt because it is so fundamental, it's so core, it's so basic, and it's the source of all order, of all life, of all duality in the Eibush's creation, although it itself is not living. It itself is not subject to that kind of a order, that kind of a duality. So again, by the way I'm reading it is that he's suggesting, that the Ramban is suggesting, I don't see this in the Ramban at all, that salt represents the atoms, the most the most elemental dimension of a physical existence, which has absolutely no life and no order whatsoever, and it's the source of all life, and the source of all order, and the salt you give to the Eibishter to say that even though this itself has no life, it's the basis for, it's the building blocks of, and the preservation of all life. So this is the idea of giving salt to the Beis HaMikdash, and this explains why there's a covenant associated with it. Because essentially, we're saying everything is God's, even things that are not living. Because the things which are not living are the basis of life. So you have 4 different interpretations of the meaning of the words, the covenant of salt. The first interpretation is that the covenant includes salt also. The second interpretation is that the covenant sweetens salt. The third interpretation, the covenant that reunifies everything that's been scattered and split through the original sin and bringing it back to the Eibishter Arizal. And the fourth interpretation, the covenant that even when you see no life at all, that too is God. And then you get to the Alter Rebbe, which is on page 9. This is a very, very famous Maimer V'lei Tashbis. The Maimer is very short, and the Abiyah is very long. People sometimes even skip the Maimer. The Rebbe links salt to Chochmah. We've been linking salt to Zeir Anpin, according to the Ramban, or to Malchus, according to the Rikanti and the Zayar, and the Chaymer Ayuli, according to the Panim Yafos. The Alter Rebbe says salt is Chochmah. In other words, salt is not lower than life, but it's higher than life. And he brings the same points. Salt preserves, and salt separates. You have blood with meat, you can't eat it, you separate the blood out. Salt preserves, salt separates, salt gives taste, and salt calls out flavor. Right? Those are 4 different things. It gives taste to bread, it brings out the flavor from the meat, it takes the blood out of the meat, it separates, and it preserves. But salt by itself is none of the above. Salt has no taste, and salt has no flavor, and salt can't be eaten. But salt has a quality to have an incredible effect on many other things. So Alter Rebbe gives a dogma. The dogma is that when you want to make cheese, you use rennet. Keva. Rennet is meat. I mean, Bechlal. Did you ever notice that milk and meat come from the same place, from a cow? It's a funny thing. I mean, no one pays attention. You can't eat milk and meat together. They come from the same source. The halacha, nevertheless, is you can't eat meat and milk. And there's a whole arichas in Kabbalah and in Mefarshim why, but that's a mitzvah. When you want to make cheese, in the olden days, they used rennet. What's rennet? It's from the stomach of an animal. The stomach of an animal is meat. Even the udders, the cow, the nipples from which the milk itself is drawn, there's a way to kasher it and eat it. And it's fleishik, it's not milchik. You can't eat it with milk. Keva, the stomach, is used to mix with cheese. So the whole shaila, cheese should automatically be treif. Why? Because to make cheese, you're putting in meat. The quantity of the meat is insignificant. The halach is davar hamaymed in a bottle. When something is used to create a form, it's never bottled, it's never nullified. That tiny bit of keva, that tiny bit of rennet, since it's creating the form, the binyan of the gvina, of the cheese, it's never bottled. So of course, what's the answer? When you eat cheese, you're not eating rennet. Because rennet is not a part of the cheese. It creates the cheese, but it's not a part of the cheese. Theoretically, the same rennet can be used again and again and again and again. It acts like a catalyst. A catalyst is not something which is measured in quantity, it's measured in quality. In other words, it's not that a certain percentage of cheese is rennet. You put rennet to create the cheese. If you could take that rennet out, you could use it again. And it never is exhausted. Because cheese is cheese. Cheese is made from milk. The rennet is not part of the cheese, it's not a flavor of the cheese or the substance of the cheese, it's the creator of the cheese and it's above it. So the Alter Rebbe says, this is how you have to understand the relationship between salt and everything. It gives taste and it gives flavor and it separates and it preserves. And it's none of those things. It's higher than reality. Reality are things that need taste. Reality are things that need flavor. Reality are things that need to be clarified. Kedusha and klipa are mixed together. You have to separate the blood from the meat, the treif from the kosher, the klipa from the kedusha. And reality is things that need to be preserved. The salt is that entity that affects all of these things that's above the creation. And he says it's b'chochma is beriru. The concept of chochma. Chochma is above reality, and yet the entire order and form and health and constructiveness in the creation comes from salt. And he finishes with an incredible insight. And that's how we're going to conclude this class. The Gemara says, if you have a silo full of grain, and you don't have a kav chumtin, kav is a small amount of chaymet. Chaymet is a preservative. The grain is useless. Why? A parasite is going to come, the winter is going to come, the moisture is going to come and destroy it all. If you have a smaller quality, and you have a little bit of preserve, because you have a kav chumtin, there's a point in holding on to what you possess, because it's going to be preserved. Salt is a preservative. Says the Rebbe, where do you see the inyan of salt in Yiddishkeit? And specifically in Torah. Says the Alter Rebbe, the inyan of salt in Torah is Kabbalah. Kabbalah is separate from real life. Kabbalah is not our Shulchan Aruch. We follow Shulchan Aruch, which is emphatically Al Pi Nigla. But when a person learns Torah and a person practices Yiddishkeit, how does he know that he's not going off the correct path? So you need a preservative. Something which keeps you in the right place. This preservative which keeps you in the right place is not a part of your life. It preserves your life. And that's what Soy does. Kabbalah is a level of Torah, you understand it and you don't understand it. But it does not allow you to go off the correct path in your study of Pshat and Remez and Drush. So the Rebbe says, Kabbalah is to Torah what salt is to meat. And the Eibishter makes a covenant. You have to include a salt in a korban. What's the salt? The salt is not the reality of the korban. The salt is the preservation of the korban. Like the Tosfos said an hour ago. Salt preserves, a korban preserves. The salt represents something which is above the reality, that keeps the reality in check. There's a very interesting letter from the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe. The Rebbe's father was a big mekubal, Kiyadua. And the Rebbe and his father corresponded for that decade that the Rebbe was in Europe, Western Europe, and the Rebbe's father was trapped in Russia. Unfortunately, that correspondence is lost. We have the Rebbe's father's letters, which the Rebbe kept, but we don't have the Rebbe's own letters to his father. He apparently did not keep himself copies. We don't have them. Tragically, unfortunately. But we have Rebbe Leivik's responses. And in one of the letters from Rebbe Leivik to the Rebbe, he writes, I received your letter, and the topic, the essay that you wrote is incredible, it's brilliant, but there's no Kabbalah. And the Rebbe's father writes to the Rebbe that when you finish writing an essay on Nigla de Torah, you ask yourself a simple question: how do I know that this essay is Lamitas Shel Torah, is credible or is incredible? So you measure it against Kabbalah. If Kabbalah concurs with the conclusions, you know it's emes. And if it doesn't, if Kabbalah is not able to carry it through, you know that somewhere there's a mistake in the Nigla de Torah. And he brings the same Gemara that Torah, Kabbalah is a kav chumtin, it's a preservative. So if this is a Parsha Bris Melach, you're bringing a carbon of salt. What is salt? Salt is nothing. Who needs salt? It's unhealthy. Says the Alter Rebbe, not like the Panim Yafos, that is the bedrock of material. Salt represents something which is not yet a thing. It has no reality. It's useful in this world. But it's the preservation and the source of all things. In life, in Yiddishkeit, you have to have a little salt. It's only a little salt. Like you can't eat salt. But you need something to preserve the Yiddishkeit, which is the bread and the meat that we invest in our Yiddishkeit. You have to have a little bit of a preserve. And the preservation is the Pnimis Ateda, the Kabbalah that we invest in our Yiddishkeit. We haven't yet answered the question about how come salt is mentioned after by Mincha and not by Karbonis. Yeah, why is it 2 times by Mincha and by Karbonis? So here goes my own creativity. This is completely without a source. What's the difference in a Karban and a Mincha? Between a meal offering and a meat offering. So it says in Sfar, it says in Hasidus, that the Karban's whole direction is to raise something up to the Eibishter. You know what the word Mincha means? Like the word Chosan and like the word Nachas. To bring down. It says in Gemara, and it's explained in Hasidus, the Karban raises up and the Mincha brings down. What's the difference when you raise something up to the Eibishter and you bring something down? What's the difference? When you give something away to the Eibishter, you don't have to worry about what happens to it, because it's in the Eibishter's world. You don't have to worry about organization. Is it going to fit into the Eibishter's realm appropriately? When something is raised up, included in Elokus, it's lost. Oila, it's going up. When you bring in the Eibishter down, it's not enough to bring him down. You got to bring him down in a constructive way. And that's the mincha. So the need for a preservative is far more significant in mincha than in oila. Think about it. If karbanos represent raising up to the Eibishter, and the mincha represents bringing the Eibishter into the world, the need for a preservative is primarily in a mincha. So when it comes to a mincha, to the mitzvah say and the mitzvah leisa say, you're bringing alakus into this world, you need the preservative. Preservative means that even though godliness is taking on a form, it should be loyal to its source. And there's a negative prohibition. Leitashbis bris melach. God forbid you bring the Eibishter into this world and you're lacking the melach, you're lacking the preservative. You can make the case that meat, a carbon, shouldn't need preservative at all. You're going out of this world, you're going up to the Eibishter, so I need salt. And I suppose the answer is that even when a person is sacrificing himself to the Eibishter, there's a healthy way and there's an unhealthy way. And you need salt for that too. But it's less significant than the necessity for salt in a carbon mincha, because a mincha means bringing the Eibishter down. When you bring the Eibishter into the world, there's two issues. Number one, bringing him down is a greater effort. And number two, bringing him down means he has to settle and be preserved. And that's the message of Bris Melach.